Hey guys, Dr. Joel Seedman here. In today's video, we're going to be discussing why 90-degree joint angles are so important, not just for athletic performance, but also for strength, muscle growth, and joint health. And I want to really examine the hardcore sciences here so that we can see why 90 degrees is so effective and contrast that to kind of the bro science of full range of motion training. And in order to build the foundation of this 90-degree eccentric isometric method that I use, I want to highlight the three key pillars of kinesiology and go into more depth about those. We're going to go into the biomechanics, we're going to go into the structural muscle physiology, and then the third and last pillar will be the neuromuscular physiology. So let's get started. So the first topic I want to go over is scientific congruency. And all that means is that if we look at the three fundamental pillars of kinesiology or exercise science, all three of those pillars should be congruent or in agreement with each other with no contradiction. That also means that if we're examining any training protocol or training program, or even just a new piece of research or research study that comes out, it can't be contradicting any of those three disciplines, because if it is, then we know something is off or something is amiss, or perhaps the study wasn't performed accurately. And what I want to do with the 90-degree method is show that all three disciplines of kinesiology, they're actually in agreement with each other, and they actually point to the 90-degree joint angle as being optimal for human movement. I want to go over biomechanics and how it relates to human movement and the 90-degree joint angles. But before I do that, I want to reiterate something that I've mentioned literally hundreds of times in my posts and in my videos. And if we need to make a separate video on this, I will. And that's 90-degree joint angles, such as during a squat. It's not a parallel position where your thighs are parallel to the floor. When we're referencing 90-degree joint angles, it's the joint angles in relationship to each other, or the joints in relationship to the other joints. It's not the joints in relationship to the ground or any other external surface. So when we look at a 90-degree joint angle on a squat, it's typically going to be 20 to 40 degrees above parallel due to tibial inclination. But once again, we can do more content on that just to clear that up. If we look at the field of biomechanics, perhaps the most relevant topic that's often discussed is anatomical leverage or anatomical levers. And that's kind of a fancy way of taking physics and applying it to human movement. For example, in physics, we know that if you're using something like a wrench or a tool, that applying force with a 90-degree lever arm is going to allow you to produce the most torque and force to provide the most effective work to be done at that point of time. So the same actually applies to kinesiology and human movement. We want to place ourselves in the most mechanically advantageous position possible where we have strong leverage, and we want to avoid positions that are biomechanically disadvantageous where we essentially can't produce or provide as much torque or force. And the research is pretty conclusive on this, that 90-degree joint angles or 90-degree positions optimizes our biomechanical leverage and anatomical leverage. So not only does this allow us to produce the most force and torque, but it also allows us to absorb the most force. That means that we can produce movements that are very explosive, very strong, but we're also protecting our joints because we're placing our body into a position that's biomechanically very strong. And this is why often when you look at people jump or even during sprinting, they're using 90-degree joint angles almost intuitively without anyone having to tell them, because the body gravitates towards those positions. Another topic I want to address in the field of biomechanics is elastic energy. And that simply describes how our muscles store potential energy and use it for movement. We often see in the literature that they use springs or spring-like mechanisms to illustrate how muscles work, and we want to basically optimize the spring-like nature of our muscles. And if we're looking at how to optimize that elastic energy, we kind of have two sides of the equation, or this balance that we want to find between a tissue or muscle that's overly stiff and overly rigid compared to one that's overly loose and overly compliant. We want to find a nice balance that optimizes our elastic energy. And most biomechanists and even physicists will agree that we want the stiffest usable conditions when it comes to our muscles. And that stiffest usable condition usually is a more compact motion closer to 90-degree joint angles. If we go past that, or shorter than that, we actually lose a lot of that ability to use elastic energy for our movement. Now, some of you watching this might be thinking, well, I'm not worried about joint health as much. I'm just worried about, maximizing my gains in the gym and wanting to get stronger and bigger and whatnot. Well, here's the cool thing. When we actually look at the structural muscle physiology of exercise science, it further highlights that the 90-degree joint angle positions will help us maximize muscle growth and strength. So let's kind of deep dive into some of those topics. So we're going to talk a little bit more about structural muscle physiology, and that's basically where we look at the internal level of what's going on inside the muscle and the muscle fibers themselves. And within structural muscle physiology, we have this topic known as the length-tension relationship of muscle fibers. And this simply describes this phenomenon where if a muscle is overly lengthened or overly shortened, it can't produce or absorb as much force and torque. And so there's this range and this kind of sweet spot when we're talking about how fibers and muscles overlap, where we produce maximal force, and that range is 0 to 90. And 90 degrees is often where we do produce the most force because we have the optimal level of overlap within the muscle. And so we've optimized that length-tension relationship. Related to this whole principle of the length-tension relationship of muscle fibers is another subtopic within structural muscle physiology, and it has to do with something called cross bridges. And cross bridges, if we look at the science, it's basically describing how the little structures and proteins within the muscle fibers themselves attach and detach to each other in order to create movement. When we look at the research, it shows that that moderately stretched or mid-stretch position, roughly 90 degrees, is how we optimize the number of cross bridges. And the number of cross bridges is a good indicator of motor unit recruitment, which basically means muscle activation. And muscle activation is an excellent indicator of how much force and torque we can produce, and also how much we can effectively and efficiently overload the muscle, or basically how much weight we can lift. And the more weight you can lift, the more overload you can create. That means more muscle growth. So again, if you want to maximize muscle growth and strength and hypertrophy, guess what? Those 90-degree positions will optimize the cross bridges, which will allow us to produce more force, overload more, and gain more muscle growth. Okay, so we've covered biomechanics as one of the key foundations or pillars of kinesiology. We've also covered the structural muscle physiology as the second pillar. Third pillar I want to go over is the neuromuscular physiology. And neuromuscular physiology basically talks about how our central nervous system, which is our brain, our spinal cord, and nerves, and how it functions with our skeletal muscles to produce and create movement. So when it comes to muscle memory, which is actually neuromuscular memory, it's based on this kind of complex topic of calcium release, and calcium being this second messenger that signals muscle memory. And the greater the amplitude and duration of calcium released, the more muscle memory we produce. Now, that's all fancy jargon, but what's important to understand here is that strength training produces high levels of calcium release. That means that strength training has the potential to create very high levels of muscle memory or neuromuscular memory, and that can be a good thing or a bad thing. And here's why. Movement transfers. So how we create muscle memory and how we move in the weight room or when we do our strength training, ultimately, it's going to transfer to all other areas of life. Sprinting, running, walking, jogging, even how we pick things up off the floor, our sitting posture, whatever it may be. If we're strength training with positions that are greater than 90 degrees and we're really overstretching the muscle, what's going to happen is that when we go to the field or when we go play our sport or when we run or sprint, it's going to be ingrained in our nervous system that we have to overstretch again. And so what ends up happening is we place ourselves into these biomechanically disadvantageous positions where we can actually overstretch a muscle because that's what we've been practicing. And now we just set ourselves up for injury or for even just inflammation of the tissues. And we see this a lot with our athletes who come to us initially. The ones who do the most stretching, the ones who really emphasize their mobility and flexibility, those are the same athletes that are always pulling or tearing their hamstrings specifically because they practice overstretching in the weight room, and that transfers to their sprinting and their stride mechanics. So when they sprint and stride, their bodies are used to breaching those 90-degree boundaries of movement. And again, that's how they pull things. So once again, how we move in the weight room transfers to how we move in all other aspects of life. So it's absolutely imperative that we optimize our movement mechanics and create those optimal 90-degree positions in the weight room so it transfers optimally to everything else. Another area of discussion that I want to cover in the topic of neuromuscular physiology is muscle spindles and proprioception. So I covered a little bit of this in my last video, but just for a recap, muscle spindles are these little feedback mechanisms that are embedded within our structural skeletal muscles, and they provide all this information about our sense of feel and about our joint positioning, our body positioning, and they give us this sensory feedback so that we can fine-tune our movement. And again, that's basically what proprioception and kinesthetic awareness are. It's our sense of feel, and those muscle spindles provide that sense of feel. If we look at the literature, the more we can activate those muscle spindles and the more information that we can gain from those muscle spindles, the better we can fine-tune our movement. But those muscle spindles, in order to activate them, it requires several things. First off, it requires high levels of tension, it requires high levels of stretch, and it also requires high levels of stiffness. So, and again, those muscle spindles, say for example, if we're doing something like a bench press, we need to actually stretch the pectorals to activate those muscle spindles. But we also have to have high levels of stiffness and tension. Otherwise, those muscle spindles become slack because the muscles aren't activated as much as they could be. So a lot of people think that in order to maximize muscle spindle activation, you want to have this ultra high degree of stretch. That's not the case, because in order to have that ultra high level of stretch, you sacrifice a ton of tension and muscle stiffness. So the muscle stiffness we know is absolutely critical for activating muscle spindles and getting that feedback. But what's also critical for creating that stiffness is something I talked about as well in the last video, and that is co-contraction. And so I want to use the bench press again as an example. When we do something like a bench press, we need to use our back muscles to pull into position. We're not just letting the bar come down. We're pulling ourselves, we're pulling the bar as hard as we can into that stretch position. When we look at all of the research on this topic of muscle spindles and proprioception, it points to this moderately stretched position, once again, as being the optimal position for maximizing muscle spindle activation and proprioception. So basically the 90-degree position. And in fact, when we look at the literature on co-contraction, where our back is pulling as hard as we can against our chest muscles during the bench press, for example, that is maximized at roughly that 90-degree joint angle position. Now, some of you watching this might be thinking like, all right, well, the stretch reflex is such a huge component of strength training and athletic performance. And the stretch reflex basically is a mechanism within our muscles that if a muscle is stretched very quickly, it's going to rebound and resist that stretch, so we produce force or torque when that muscle is stretched abruptly. And the stretch reflex is critical for explosive movements like plyometrics, or really even when we do strength training. One misconception of the stretch reflex is that you have to go excessively deep to activate it, because again, a lot of people think, well, the stretch reflex is dependent on stretch, so the more I stretch my muscle, the more that reflexive reaction is going to kick in. And that's actually totally false. With the stretch reflex, we want to have high levels of stiffness, because this goes back to something we talked about earlier with biomechanics. We want the muscles to be like a spring. And if the muscle has that high spring-like mechanisms to it, it's going to produce a lot of force when it recoils back to its position. So when we actually look at what most people think the stretch reflex is, essentially what they're doing when they're going down deep on a squat, they're not activating their stretch reflex. It's a pseudo stretch reflex where they're basically bouncing off of and ricocheting off their tendons and ligaments and connective tissue. It's not their muscles any longer. So if you really want to optimize the stretch reflex, it actually occurs at 90-degree positions, which again is why when you see people jump or do plyometrics, you're not going to see them going past 90-degree joint angles. So I want to cover quickly two common myths or misconceptions that people often ask questions about. And the first one deals with research studies that come out, and it shows that 120 degrees for this particular scientific study produce more muscle growth. We have to understand why that might have happened. This goes back to the topic of scientific congruency. We know, and we've already established, that the 90-degree positions optimize muscle activation and motor unit recruitment. And basically, that means we're going to have the ability to produce more muscle growth and overload the muscle more effectively. So if a study comes out that suggests anything different than that, we have to examine why the conclusion of that study or the results of that study are contradictory to some of those fundamental disciplines of kinesiology, particularly structural muscle physiology. If I'm doing a bench press and I'm not creating those high levels of stiffness and co-contraction, and I'm not pulling the bar down or pulling into position as hard as I can, in order to create any semblance of stretch and tension within the muscle, you're actually going to have to reach excessive depths to create ample levels of muscle activation. So that doesn't mean that you have to create greater range of motion to get more muscle activation and more growth. It's simply highlighting that in that study, poor technique, which is unfortunately is often used in these research studies because you don't have competent coaches and practitioners demonstrating or showing the participants what proper form is. And I've seen this firsthand at the university level, watching some of these studies taking place. And for example, on that bench press or even on the squat, if you don't know how to create tension and stiffness and co-contraction, you're going to have to reach excessive depths and excessive range of motion to have any semblance of stretch and muscle activation. But the solution is to actually create that tension and stretch from your nervous system, which when we do that, 90 degrees is going to be where we have the most muscle activation and ultimately the most muscle growth. The other common misconception that I want to address is oftentimes people will say that 90-degree joint angles or 90-degree positions, it has the greatest level of shear and compressive forces, which you can kind of misinterpret that and suggest that as a result, you might have more tension on the joints or perhaps be more prone to injury. That's a very common myth, and here's several reasons for that. First off, the research on shear and compressive forces is pretty mixed, and it's pretty split on where those shear forces and compressive forces are happening to their maximum. Some research shows that it happens at 90 degrees. Other research shows that it's actually least at 90 degrees, and it's 90 degrees is the best for kind of negating that. Unfortunately, that whole concept of shear and compressive forces, it's a somewhat antiquated way of looking at biomechanics and force vectors, because it's essentially examining the human body as if we were like this exoskeleton or robot without a central nervous system. And when you take the central nervous system or the neuromuscular physiology into account, what ends up happening is it alters how we examine force vectors, because what's more important than how much force is coming into the joints is how much or how good of a position we're in for our muscles to absorb force around those joints. So whether or not the shear and compressive force is maximal at 90 degrees or whether it's not, even if it is, the 90-degree position, as we've already alluded to with all the other research, that position is where our muscles are in the best position to absorb force and protect our joints. So it's actually the safest position. To kind of drive that point home is if we look at something like a hip hinge or an RDL, the science of shear and compressive forces suggests that that's a terrible exercise for the low back because you have so much force going through the spine. But we actually know from practical application that the RDL or hip hinge is one of the best exercises for improving spinal health because it teaches our body how to activate the muscles around the spine, around the hips, and around the low back so that it's protecting our body and it's teaching those muscles how to wake up so it absorbs force around the spine. All right, so some of you at this point might be asking, well, if these 90-degree positions are so critical for getting into when we're doing any of our strength training or any of our high force exercises and activities, how can we get there and how do we know we're there? What I want to really emphasize here is that the 90-degree position is not something that has to be forced. I talked about this a little bit in my last video, but if posture is set perfectly, and that starts with head position, we'll do some other videos in the future about that. If our posture is set, if we have maximal full body tension, if our feet are locked in, if our core is braced, and if we go to our first natural stopping point and even the farthest position we can achieve without sacrificing any of those components, we're inevitably going to find the 90-degree position. Something that can actually kind of help illustrate that further is one of the common criticisms that I receive when people look at my videos of my athletes or myself or any of my clients is they often say, well, how come your athletes or your clients, or they're all doing the same exact exercises the same way? Their squats look the same, their hip hinges look the same, their chest presses, even the different variations look the same. Why are you coaching people to do exercises the exact same way when everybody's body is different? What that does is it actually highlights how our clients and our athletes gravitate to these 90-degree positions, and we don't actually have to force it. In fact, I'm at the point with my own training where it can take me 2 or 3 minutes to get a new athlete into these 90-degree positions without really having to force them into it or having to give them much instructional cueing other than, hey, let's get your posture locked in, let's get your core locked in, keep full body tension, find that first natural stopping point. And inevitably, every athlete, every client, every human being for that matter, they're pretty much going to gravitate to that 90-degree position because it's something that's innate into our nervous system, that's kind of hardwired, that our body wants to move into those positions, which again is why you don't have to coach people how to jump from 90 degrees. They jump from 90 degrees whether you coach them or whether you haven't, because again, that's where the body naturally wants to produce high force from. Now, some of you may be wondering at this point, okay, Joel, you keep talking about the 90-degree method or the 90-degree joint angles. You've given a good amount of science, and perhaps some of you watching this are maybe convinced or semi-convinced of the research that I've given in this video. And you're wondering to yourself, why are no other fitness experts and strength coaches and physical therapists and performance specialists discussing this or highlighting the 90-degree position? Or why is there no one else really emphasizing it to the extent that I am? Well, I want to kind of go back to when I was doing my PhD. There wasn't one particular discipline within kinesiology that I could look to that gave me all the answers. I couldn't just look at the structural muscle physiology. I couldn't just look at the biomechanics and the length tension relationship of how muscles work. I literally had to take all the different disciplines and even the subtopics within those disciplines and grab the different pieces of the puzzle and then try to put them together and also make sure they made sense and were congruent with each other. That took years. That was not something that just took a few weeks. And quite frankly, it even went back to my undergraduate and master's studies. I had to take all that information and basically say, what does all this science point to? What is all this suggesting? And again, all of it, when you look at the congruency of it, the structural muscle physiology, the biomechanics, the neuromuscular physiology, the subcategories within that, it all points to the 90-degree position as being optimal for human movement. I don't want to throw shade or kind of bash other fitness influencers and other trainers in this industry, but one of the most common problems in strength training and the strength and conditioning world, and even practically applied kinesiology, is that everyone goes to school and learns these things that I've highlighted. And even if they didn't go to school, these are things that can be found in any basic level muscle physiology textbook or biomechanics textbook or neuromuscular physiology textbooks. These are simple, fundamental principles. And most competent trainers learn these concepts. They learn them early on in their undergraduate or even master's level classes. What ends up happening is they treat the science as kind of this separate entity. They learn it and it's like, oh, well, that's really cool. Now let's go strength train and keep doing what we've been doing because our coaches before that were doing it this way, and Arnold did it this way, and all the bodybuilders before them did it this way, and they did it that way because their coaches did it that way. And so what ends up happening is you have all these fitness professionals and trainers who they learn the science just like I did, but they essentially ignore it and just go back to this old school dogma and bro science rather than taking the research and saying, okay, this is interesting. Let's see if we can apply this at the practical level to strength training instead of just disregarding and thinking, oh, it's cool science, but it's for the lab. No, it's for practical application in the field of human movement, and we can use it on our clients and on our athletes and on ourselves when it comes to strength training. So I've just irrefutably demonstrated to you all that the 90-degree position is in fact the optimal position when it comes to strength training. I just highlighted all the research. There's nothing in the research or science that contradicts this. So unless you're training to go into Cirque du Soleil or ballet or some type of Russian Cossack dancing where you're going to be placing yourself into these extreme contortionistic positions, you owe it to yourself to use these 90-degree principles, because it's going to optimize your human physiology, your performance, your muscle function, and ultimately it's going to optimize your quality of life and your physique and your strength. So at this stage, like, there's not much else that I can say to try to convince you guys other than try it. That's all I ask. Try it for a few weeks. Give it an honest, fair attempt. Don't just try it for one workout, but give it a true, honest attempt. And when you do that, I've never had anyone try the 90-degree eccentric isometric method and then abandon it, because the results are so good. Even the first few sessions, even if they haven't produced results in terms of strength or size, they can feel the difference in how their muscles contract. They can feel the difference how their body isn't achy. They're recovering better. Their joints don't hurt. They have stronger contractions. They feel that muscle-mind connection more. So please try it before you bash it. And that's really all I have to say about this topic. Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you like this video, check out this other one. I think you'll find it just as informative.